My name is Matthew Durdy, I'm Chief Executive of the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. We're a research institution about research and technology, and we have a great privilege, two of which I want to talk about. One of which is we work with these amazing therapeutics, ATMPs, and Tim outlined earlier on our responsibility as an industry to bring those therapeutics to patients. The other thing is that we have the privilege of being able to, and mandated, to look ahead, to say what's coming up for the development of the industry, which is a great luxury, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that now. Our vision as an institution is to see a thriving industry delivering ATMPs to the world. The industry isn't in that place right now, and I think Tim outlined a question earlier on. Is the system ready? And I hope that through this panel today, we'll talk about not is the system ready, but how do we get the system ready? The structure of the morning, or this session, is we'll give a series of short topic areas, and at the end of each one, we're going to come back to the audience and say, have you got any points you want to make? Have you got any questions you want to make? So please start to warm yourselves up and think for that. And for those that are operating the microphones, we'll be coming to those within a few minutes, not right at the end of the session. We've got a fantastic panel. You've basically heard everything you're going to hear from me today, because I'm going to be handing over to Lutz, Bonacker, Emmanuel, Chantelot, and Christine Fox, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves very briefly now, and they'll get a chance to talk a little bit more later on. Lutz.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lutz Bonacker. I'm the SVP and GM for Commercial Operations Europe at CSL Behring. CSL Behring is, together with CSL Vifor, CSL Seqirus, and CSL Plasma, part of the global CSL group.
Good morning, everyone. Emmanuel, Chantelot, Bristol-Myers, Squibb. I'm based in Brussels, and I lead international policy and government affairs for all markets outside of the United States.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Fox. Lovely to be with you all today. I'm president of Novartis Gene Therapies, and I look after 3 medicines in this space, but the one I'll be focused on today is our flagship product, Zolgensma, for spinal muscular atrophy.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we've got a range of different therapeutic types here, which I think is quite important, or may or may not be important in the discussion. Let's find out as we go through. Let's kick off with the first topic. Lutz, you've kindly undertaken to set the scene for us. We've had a little bit of scene setting already. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, about CSL, and outline for us where you think the industry is today in terms of its readiness.
Yeah, look, I think quite excitingly, I think CSL as a group is a company that's really focused on making a difference for patients, and that's, I think, also why I really enjoy doing what I'm doing. CSL is using 3 technologies, and specifically within CSL Behring. It's classical plasma fractionation, but also recombinant technologies, and now, and I think that's why I'm sitting here today, also gene therapies, both in the in vivo component, as we'll be talking about today, and an early stage in the ex vivo, as we're looking at it in the early development phase. The therapeutic areas we're covering with that are primarily immunology, bleeding disorders, respiratory, cardiovascular, and also transplant. So those are the areas we're focusing those technologies on. But moving to the second part of your question, if one looks at how industry is commercializing today, I think we're commercializing today in a manner I think we'll be further along in 5 years as a start. I think that's something that we do see, because if you look at the number of ATMPs that are approved in Europe, there's not that many. If you look at the number of ATMPs that are reimbursed in Europe, there's even less. But if you then take a look also at the ARM database and see how many clinical trials are ongoing, and that's more than 2,000. And if you take a look at that and that flowing through, I think that does lead us to believe that there's innovation coming that will in the end help patients. But if you take a look at the environment the industry is pushing that into, or working with patients to make it available, it's very fragmented, the environment. After the centralized approval process, you have still very national reimbursement situations. You then take a look at the access pathways, which are, to be honest, still very challenging, because again, they're country by country, and they're not built fit for purpose for ATMPs at this stage. There is, however, and I think that is a positive note to take along, a willingness of the payers and the players in the reimbursement part to talk and to interact, and together to try to see how we can shape it for the future. So there is a need for a joint effort, and the development must happen. And I think the biggest component in the commitment to a solution-oriented approach needs to be that how do we break through that question of chronic therapy translated into one-time therapy and doing it in a manner that then shapes the reimbursement environment and does not administer the reimbursement environment. Because if you administer, you're going to be going at 110, but you're going to hit the wall and it won't work. And I think that's one of the future challenges we need to face.
Great. Emmanuel, I want to build on what Lutz said and talk about where we are in the sector. In Europe, we really have leadership in cell and gene therapies. We have world-class investigators and academic centers. And on the supply side of innovation, if we look at the statistics, 3, 4, 5 ATMPs approved per year over the past few years in Europe, but projections of FDA and EMA would be 10 to 20 ATMPs per year from 2025 onwards. So it's really a wave of innovation. If you look at the demand side of innovation in the markets, the healthcare systems, the payers, the Ph.D. agencies still need to adapt to this new wave in terms of appreciating the long-term benefits of the therapies, accepting the uncertainty of evidence at approval, and also how to cope with the high upfront costs of therapies.
Christine, did you want to add anything to this before we move on?
No, I mean, I think where we're headed next is access, and I think it bridges really nicely. I think you've pointed out some of the gaps in kind of a macro level, for sure.
Okay. Are there any questions or points from the floor? That's better. I can see now. Anything from the floor? Any questions? No. Okay. Let's move on from that base where we're saying, the last presentation and Lutz's introduction, we're starting to see this picture of an emerging sector, if you like. Christine, you've been through the process of bringing therapeutics into commercialization in Europe. Tell us a little bit about your own organization, Novartis Gene Therapy, yourself. Actually, the audience is always very interested in the individuals on the panel and how they got to where they are as well, and what you see from your experience about what needs to be done.
Yeah, it's been fascinating, and I'm relatively new to this space. I joined Novartis Gene Therapies about 18 months ago, so a lot of the work that I'm going to reference today actually happened long before I joined because, as we've kind of all articulated, it's a very, very long process. And I think squarely where we're at now is there are some reasons and proof of concept, reason for belief, but, I think the combination of things that we've been sorting to solve is access and patient identification. And for us, as you said, Lutz, really well, it's a massive change for the system to go from chronic therapies now to one-time therapies. They just don't think about it that way. They don't consume our products in that way. And so it has been a big disruptor. For Zolgensma specifically, we have regulatory approval in about 48 or so countries and access agreements in 35. So that in and of itself kind of shows the gap. But there's lots of good that has come out of this and lots of problems that I think we still have to solve, and some opportunities. One of I think the biggest learnings that we've had, particularly in Europe, is making sure that we don't make the mistake that we kind of accuse, our partners across the table of, which is treating everything the same. I think we've seen even in the last year with the macro and microeconomic changes across the globe that the person you're sitting across is going to be solving for very different things as they manage their budget, if they're thinking quarterly or they're thinking long-term. And so when you're talking one-time therapies, there's a whole cadre of things that they're going to be looking at. And I think we have found the most productive conversations is really unpacking that with them. Now, certainly that takes trust and takes some time, but we've been looking at things like retroactive rebates so that it doesn't delay access to patients because we're sorting out the finer details, or things like deferred payments once we've agreed that there is a path forward. And I think the time that we've seen kind of the most development is really bespoke agreements that look at outcomes-based, kind of a risk-share approach of really understanding. And I think that becomes a win-win because it suits the payer or the HTA really well, and it also suits us very well because from an innovator perspective, I think we have belief in the science, we know what it's capable of, and saying that, hey, this innovation is going to deliver you these things, and that has a value associated for your ecosystem becomes a really meaningful conversation. I think the next big thing that goes kind of hand in hand with that is patient identification, and this is something that I think is very applicable from lots of places, but that we often take for granted. And in our case, the earlier the identification, because we're dealing with babies, the better, but it's very hard to diagnose these babies sometimes, and it's even better if they get treated pre-symptomatically. So, a perfect panacea would be that we had global newborn screening, but very difficult, not unlike access, because most countries don't have the infrastructure to do that. They can't flip a switch and make that happen. So we find ourselves in a situation where, in fact, we're testing and learning with them. Many countries in Europe want to do pilots, which are incredibly, cost intensive and time consuming, but likely very necessary because it's helping them and allowing them to build their infrastructure. But this is the gateway, obviously, to bringing innovation directly to patients. And we've seen some success in this as well. Just to give you a perspective, in the US, for instance, we have about 98% newborns screened, which makes for a wonderful partnership with physicians and payers so that we can identify these patients early and see the most benefit. In Europe, we're at about 45%, knowing that we need to try to get that as high as possible. Our goal is to seek about 60% newborn screening by the end of the year. But it's literally brick by brick, place by place, and it's not easy. And I think that again is back to partnerships. The patient advocacy organizations, and I know we'll hear from some later today, are extraordinary in their understanding of the detailed data and really understanding individual patient journeys that can differ from country to country and look very differently. So I think in totality what we're saying is that it's a partnership, and it's not easy, and we're often not pushing on an open door, right? I think there's been lots of things that the industry at large has done to kind of recalibrate and partner in a way that we've never done before. We've been talking about value-based agreements for 30 years since I've been in this industry, and now for the first time we're actually seeing it come to fruition.
Brilliant, thank you. And hopefully we'll come back to that question of the partnership. Is it a partnership between healthcare systems and individual companies, or a partnership between the industry and the healthcare systems together? Emmanuel, did you want to say something?
So just building on what Chris said, let's face it, it's quite a challenging environment for cell and gene therapy developers and manufacturers in Europe, because we face a couple of complexities. We're in the field of CAR-T at BMS. First, you have the complexity of the market access environment with the way the benefit assessment frameworks are set up and not necessarily adapted to this type of therapies. Second, you have the complexity of scale and manufacturing and providing supply of commercial CAR-Ts with the expectations that customers have of high-quality CAR-T. So I would agree with you that it needs to be a partnership, and both the regulators and the payers should understand that there's a partnership to be built. As far as the regulators are concerned, that's often what you focus on first, the regulatory approval. There have been some adaptation of the evidence requirements, acceptance of single-arm trials, surrogate endpoints, potentially more and more acceptance of real-world evidence, which is not, unfortunately, the case if you look at Ph.D. agencies, which seem to consider that randomized controlled trials is the panacea, the one-size-fits-all. So this is where we have work to do in partnership with the payers and the Ph.D. agencies, and we can continue to talk about that later.
Brilliant, thank you. Lutz?
Yeah, just maybe a few thoughts to add to that from my side. I think the importance really is the takeaway that at the moment it is at the level of bespoke agreements. It's at the individualization component, the discussions that are happening due to the reimbursement systems at a national level. However, if you also look at some of the challenges that the payers have in the back of their head, which are more in the macroeconomic environment, everybody knows that we're still carrying a lot of costs forward from the Corona period. Everybody knows that we're investing, or there's a lot of money being spent on support of Ukraine at the moment. And then there's also, at least in some countries in Europe, that'll be a lot of effort on the whole topic of decarbonization and a lot of investment into that. So at the moment, the payers are obviously thinking, wait, where is it going to come from, the money? And with that in the back of our head, I think that's where it becomes important to have that joint approach, to have the collaborative approach, and to try to understand what your counterparts are thinking going forward. And the second topic that I think is also something that we need to look at, and that's the whole topic of real-world evidence as we gather data, which at the moment is not always accepted in discussions around reimbursement and around access. And I think that's something as one continues forward, it's also going to be quite relevant to have the acceptance of that data seen, especially also as you continue to progress along the life cycle of a product and you gain data, and you have to come back potentially for some renegotiations of pricing, which does happen in Europe in regular intervals.
Brilliant, thank you.
Just one quick add on that. I think, your point about real-world evidence is a meaningful one. And what I'd say is, unfortunately, we're in the situation right now where each country wants its own set of data, and that's not going to be sustainable. So they want, very micro country-specific data, and when we're looking at real-world evidence right now, we're reporting back out on patients that have been on Zolgensma for over 7 years. And when I look forward to the next sets of therapies that we're going to have, we're not going to be able to have that level of intimacy, with local data. We'll have to find a way to translate that much more broadly.
So I think we'll come back to this topic of scale, if you like, in a second. While we're sort of dissecting the problems and issues of the industry, are there any questions or points anywhere from the floor?
Right here.
We have one here. Do you have a microphone? Or can you project?
I can speak loud.
Go on, stand and speak.
I was wondering, in the pricing discussions and payment schedules, etc. Oh, wow. I can throw it at somebody after this, yeah.
Not me.
So for SMA, I'm looking at Chris now, there's Zolgensma, of course, and there are alternatives as well that don't have, that are not one-off treatment, and so have less upfront cost, more or less. I was just curious, do you have any idea that in practice that maybe people may have like a preference for the one that is not that doesn't have the immediate high cost? So is that something that plays a role in the practice?
So allow me to, I don't know if you want to deal specifically with a particular therapeutic, so I'll moderate the question a little bit and just say this question of innovative payment systems, basically, where you've got the choice, or the hospital system has a choice between a single upfront cost and some way of amortizing that cost over a period of time, which could be an innovative payment model, or it could be choosing another therapeutic that is administered over time. Do you have experience of that decision facing you, or being faced with that from the customer's point of view?
Yeah, so what I'd say is, it squarely rests with a specific physician, family, choice. I think what we've shown, and what continues to get feedback back to us, is that Zolgensma is the true north. If that baby presents in that way, they would choose it over and over and over again. So the idea of, in your question, and I think the reframing is the right way, is to think about how we make that possible. Certainly, that's a very local decision of what product is right for which specific patient, but that's the idea, is to unlock that value so that that baby has the best outcomes, clearly, and that we don't let the reimbursement part inhibit the best treatment option.
So we've got a moment, we're doing well for time, and so this is one of the topics that we discussed when we were preparing, is this question of alternative payment systems. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. My view is it's never really got off the ground. We've not really seen the kind of alternatives to the upfront payment that we perhaps should be seeing by now. Does anybody have any views on why that is? Why is it not coming forward? Would you want to go down that road? Are there institutional barriers to that?
Okay.
Lutz.
I think we haven't seen a lot of those alternative payment systems because of a number of reasons. I think the first reason is really the question between, again, you have a chronic therapy that you're translating into a one-time dose with a duration of potentially 15, 20, 25 years or longer in terms of efficacy. So that feeling is that the payers would come out and say, well, we need to reimburse something that the industry is telling us will last 25 years, but they have 2 to 5 years of data, maybe after the end of the pivotal trials. And that is not enough for us. So we'll give them 2 to 5 years, and then industry will say, well, we've heavily invested. It's something where we have modeling, where we have the perspective. We have, if you add some other information, we believe it'll last 25 years. But then you have very disparate opinions and views where you start the negotiation process with the payers. And I think that needs to be aligned, and every party feels that they might not be getting the value out of the negotiation that is necessary in order to proceed. So I think that's certainly a topic that one needs to look at. The other component is that the current reimbursement systems really don't cater to one-time therapy. So I think that was already identified in the pharmaceutical strategy of the European Union. So if you read the paper, they also said that we need to work together in order to ensure that we're able to translate chronic therapies into one-time payment models. Now, if you then think about how do you look at innovative components, you need to then think about how do you take into account potentially what the current comparators are and how that could kind of translate through into a type of long-term opportunity while still addressing risk sharing that allows both the industry to kind of say, well, look, we believe it'll work. But on the other hand, if it doesn't work, the payers to say, well, we're going to have some type of risk adjustment based on that part. And I think there's a number of models that are possible that we can, maybe talk about later on that one can think about in order to drive this forward.
Brilliant. I think there's something underlying. Did you want to?
I was just going to say, I'll pick up on the risk sharing thing because I think this is the biggest opportunity. Yeah. You know, in our case, I think most payers and HTAs don't look at the value as questionable. They understand that the cost of treatment versus not treating the baby, the cost would be incremental over the course of the first decade of that child's life, 2-3x of what it would be for the therapy. So I think that they get that part, but then like you say, I think the infrastructure is not set up to even execute some of these bespoke arrangements, and they're thinking about it. They don't have the infrastructure to do that. So I think there's one kind of coming up with the solution, and then two is executing against it. And it can take a tremendously long time to figure out the finer points of that because they're not set up for this. They're set up for chronic therapy.
So we'll come back to the infrastructure question, but I think we'll also come back to the trust question and this sort of relationship between the healthcare system and the industry, but it'll come up, I think, in a couple of questions' time. So I'm going to move us through the program, as is my job, and move to Emmanuel. We've talked sort of about where we are today. There's some change coming. There's some legislative change coming through. Do you want to tell us, first of all, about yourself, because it is of interest to the panel, to the audience, and then your organization, what you're working on, and some of the change that's coming through and what we should be expecting.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. You would expect the guy coming from Brussels to get the questions on legislation, so I'm going to satisfy that in a minute. So at Bristol-Myers Squibb, we have leading franchises, as you know, in oncology, hematology, immunology, and cardiovascular. Cell therapy is really a key area of research and development for us. We have a long-term commitment and long-standing investments in the space of cell therapy with, I believe, $14 billion already invested in the cell therapy franchise. We have 2 approved CAR-T cell therapy products in blood cancers, one for multiple myeloma, one for lymphoma, Abecma and Breyanzi. And we are working on accelerating the next generation of autologous cell therapies. We're also investing in expanding manufacturing capacity, notably in Europe, with an investment in Leiden in the Netherlands. So if I turn to your question, there are really 2 pieces of legislation in Europe that you all want to know everything about. Actually, Tim made it easier for me because it was on his slide. The first is the European HTA regulation. The second one is the revision of the European General Pharma legislation. So EU HTA regulation, that was adopted already 1 year ago and is being implemented. And from January 2025, all cancer products and all ATMPs, cell and gene therapies, will be subject to a joint clinical assessment by all the HTA agencies as part of a coordinating group that will be working together to assess the clinical value of therapies that have been centrally approved by the EMA. That's a very big thing. Because it will apply from 2025 onwards to all ATMPs. Are the HTA agencies ready? No, they aren't. But all the stakeholders are working together. As an industry, we are working to make sure that we can actively take part in the process of joint clinical assessment. We are making sure that it's not going to be an additional barrier to market access. And back to what I was saying earlier, we need to make sure that the methodology used by HTA agencies, the HTA methods, are adapted to the needs of small patient populations and innovative technologies like cell and gene therapies in terms of acceptance of single-arm trials and non-randomized trials, for instance. So the other piece as part of the European HTA regulation is that it is going to make more systematic joint scientific consultations, where you will see the regulators with EMA and the HTA agencies getting together early on, and potentially it's an opportunity to align on evidence requirements, because we see a divergence in terms of evidence required by the regulators versus the HTA agencies. So potentially this eventually will look at convergence, but there's some work to do. The other piece is back to the pharmaceutical strategy for Europe that was released a couple of years ago that Lutz mentioned. Later this month, the European Commission should publish its revision of the European General Pharma legislation. This is the biggest revamp of pharma legislation ever in Europe. It covers the entire life cycle, so it's not specifically for ATMPs, obviously it's all medicines. And the political motivation here is to improve access to innovative medicines across all 27 member states, also to foster innovation into unmet medical needs, address drug shortages, reduce the environmental impact. And last but not least, one positive here is it should help modernize the European regulatory framework and really have a future-proof European regulatory framework, putting EMA at par with FDA in terms of speed and regulatory approval. Now, just to finish, a couple of risks which are not specific for cell and gene therapies, but could potentially impact our innovative medicines. First, a reduction of IP, intellectual property incentives, like regulatory data protection. There was a draft of the legislation that got leaked early February, and we could see that the length of regulatory data protection could be cut from 8 years down to 6 years. Now, with the possibility for you to get it back if you meet certain conditions, like placing your product on all 27 markets, you get one more RDP, 1 more year of RDP, or running comparative trials, you could get 6 more months, or meeting high unmet needs, you could get 1 more year of RDP back. So this is all to be in a legislation that we haven't seen. We have only seen a leaked draft that will be released at the end of April. And for ATMPs, there is some good and some bad. The good thing is that for hospital exemption, there could be requirements for reporting the hospital exempted products for more transparency. The potential negative is that in the leaked draft, they are talking about exploring alternative pathways for certain less complex cell and gene therapies. What does it mean? We don't know. A lot will be defined in the guidelines. Last point for me, HTA regulation is being implemented, is going to impact all cell and gene therapies in January 2025, but the general pharma legislation will take several years to be reviewed and would only be applied from 2028 onwards. So we still have some time to prepare.
Wow. Any comments from the panel?
Yeah, I think, Emmanuel, you gave really such a comprehensive overview that I don't think there's a lot to add on the overview, but I think there's maybe 1 or 2 thoughts just to pull out. I think as one looks at the changes or the discussion of the draft, like the European pharmaceutical legislation, it is quite relevant to think about the fact that in the end, as for other things we're discussing, we need to find a commonality between all stakeholders. And the commonality between all stakeholders and pharmaceuticals is typically driven by the need to help patients. So I think that's a given. On the way there to help patients, I think, and this is the discussion that we need to try to engage in, is that it's not only a cost that the pharmaceutical industry and the broader sector is providing to Europe. I just encourage you to maybe go back and take a look at some of the Eurostat data for the export of pharmaceuticals in the last years from Europe And then I think you'll see that it's not only the cost side of things, but also the benefit side of things that within the European Union, the pharmaceuticals do provide. And that, I think, in terms of the innovation ecosystem, that is so important for all of us to continue to do what we want to do and what the patients need us to continue to do, that this is the balance that needs to be stricken in order to be able to progress and to be able to progress in a manner that meets the needs of all engaged stakeholders.
Brilliant. Any questions or points from the floor at all at this point? You can covering anything that we dealt with so far. Okay. So, Emmanuel, I'm going to come back to you. I'm conscious of the fact that there is a panel on hospital exemption later on, but I still think we can have a quick conversation about it now, about what it represents in terms of the relationship between the healthcare system, the governments, and the industry as a whole. So my question, after 10 years of having conversations about hospital exemption, is why are we still having a conversation about hospital exemption? What is it? What is it? What does it represent? And what is the underlying motivation for its active promotion?
Thank you, Matthew. There is no cell and gene therapy meeting in Europe without us talking about hospital exemption, right? It's actually 16 years since the European ATMP regulation was approved. And maybe for those of you who weren't here during the past 16 years, the hospital exemption is an article in this ATMP regulation which allows member states, the 27 countries, to permit under certain circumstances the manufacture and use of ATMPs without having to undergo the centralized authorization process in the absence of a centrally authorized product or clinical trials in the same indication. If applied in the hospital setting, on a non-routine basis, one patient at a time. Right? So there was really an intent to foster academic research and allow physicians and hospitals to treat patients in the absence of centrally authorized products. Now, what we have seen is that there's been a very different implementation of the hospital exemption across the 27 markets because local rules have applied. So there is no harmonization of the hospital exemption licensing. And over the past few years, with the economic situation, some authorities may have been tempted to address the issues of accessibility and affordability by encouraging hospital exempted products to be in direct competition with commercially developed commercial ATMPs. And obviously the risk here is that it would create a two-tier regulatory framework, right? Undermining the European process and the high quality and safety you can expect from ATMPs approved by the European Medicines Agency. But the most important point is that even though it is justified in certain circumstances, the hospital exempted pathway avoids the complexity of scale that we as commercial ATMP manufacturers face. And so this is quite fundamental. We spoke earlier about the complexity of manufacturing and distributing at scale. So I think going forward, we need to see the commercial cell therapy developers and academic cell therapy developers as partners, as complementary partners in the innovation ecosystem. It doesn't make sense to create competition between, let's say, commercial CAR-T and academic CAR-T, because as an industry, commercial developers and manufacturers, we bring the resource and the expertise for full product development, marketing authorization, commercialization across the whole of Europe, while the academic centers are really the pioneers, the leaders in innovative ideas in the development of these cell and gene therapy. So bottom line, I think we hope that the review of the general pharma legislation will emphasize that hospital exemption should remain exceptional, also in the interest of patient safety. There should be more transparency. there should be long-term follow-up for hospital exemplar products, just like we have for commercial products, appropriate use, and eventually harmonization of requirements. I'm not sure I answered your question, except to say that this is a regulation that has been predictable, the ATMP regulation. We've all been planning our development and manufacturing in the context of that regulation. Let's try not to undermine a regulation that works.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move on specifically from hospital exemption because we know there's a panel later on it. But I do think it exemplifies, in some people's minds, the relationship between the regulators and the payers and the industry, and particularly the stoking up in terms of the language that I hear of this sort of threat against the industry from the academics. And others, oh, we could produce it for $20,000 or 20,000 euros a pop. Why do we need this expensive industry? And so, Lutz, I'm going to roll into you in terms of the next question, in terms of the nature of the relationship and the environment that we're working in. Is it where we should be in terms of our relationship with the regulators and the payers? Is it a benign environment? And what should we be doing and thinking about as an industry group rather than individual companies in terms of building up a more positive relationship going forward?
I think the environment is certainly fluid at the moment. I think the environment is changing, it's adjusting, it's also being evaluated by a number of stakeholders. We talked about earlier that there's the moment is still a finite number of ATMPs that are available and that are reimbursed, and that the payers take a look at and say, okay, this is what's happening. But they're also aware of the development pipeline, and they're also aware of the clinical trials that are ongoing in the field, and are trying to think through, okay, how do we prepare ourselves for the future that's coming and that's going to be going our way? And in this context, they're a little bit nervous about it, at least from what we experienced in some of our discussions. But they're willing to interact with us as one goes forward. So I think there will need to be, looking forward, still the balance in the discussions and the system is, how do you reward innovation? How do you take a look at making sure access for patients that can benefit from a therapy is granted and is available if they're within the label component? We need to take a look at the opportunity in terms of the pharmaceutical ecosystem that I talked about earlier, to try to describe both obviously the cost component, but also the benefit component in a broader setting, both to the institutional stakeholders that are actually at the state level, so the member state level, but also at the European Union level as one goes forward. The good news is, again, the payers are willing to talk. So we've experienced that now in some of the discussions we've been having around Hemgenix as we're starting to prepare after the approval to go into the negotiations. So we've been able to talk to each and every one, for example, of the health insurance companies in Germany. They're above 80. And they were open to talking to us and looking through the options and wanting to understand what one brings to the table. And I think this component of understanding what one brings to the table is something that we as industry also need to stand up to. We need to go out and be able to share again, what do we believe that what we're developing can do? How will it be used? How will it impact? And also what's potentially, I think, the flow around the cost components that the payers will have. And again, this is where some of the concerns come in, and where also the individualization is. Some of the countries will say, okay, you can do a big lump sum up front, and then that's fine, and we just need to negotiate about the height of the lump sum. Then others are saying, well, you can spread it out, but the number of years that you can spread it out, is it 3 or 5? That's really dependent on local legislation. So there's very, very different components. And then you have clinical trials that are developed, that are done versus comparison, or against the patient himself or herself as a comparison. And then you have data. And you have data, as I touched on earlier, that might be 2 to 5 years if you add the earlier clinical stages together with the pivotal data. And then the payers will say, well, that's perfect. We'll reimburse you for the amount of data that you can provide. But that's conceptually not what's possible. So this is where the education comes into play, where you then have to say, well, if you take a look at how do you model and how do you couple the appropriate value recognition and price alignment to other methodologies that work. And ICER could be one of them, for example, where they do modeling looking forward and coming up, in the case of just Hemgenix, a durability period of around 25 years and beyond. And that's something that we've been also been able to kind of reproduce internally. But how do you get that accepted again in an environment where they're nervous about what's coming, and then also thinking about, oh, if I have all of a sudden not just one disease or two diseases or 10 diseases, but if I have 100 diseases where I have that coming at me, I won't be able to finance that anymore. So this is the discussion that I think as industry we need to have with the payers to both show, okay, this is the data, this is how we value the data, discuss it, take a look at what's appropriate risk share. Because without risk share, I don't believe you're going to get some type of agreement between the 2 to 5 years and the longer time period that you're looking at. So you need to kind of bring that together, and risk share can be one of the approaches that obviously many of us have already taken as one looks forward. And then there's other opportunities, again, to link it more to an annual payment model that is also, using as reference, the alternate therapy options that are available, and taking a look at how does that kind of roll out over the ensuing years as one progresses. So I think really interesting opportunities to do that. So I think what's important, and this is something we as a company are doing, I'm firmly convinced that with each and every model that we're offering to the payers, they have the opportunity for clear savings. And that is something that I think where the trust and the discussion goes into place, that they see it, they believe it, and that belief is also something, again, that we need to, industry is offering us something where they believe we'll have savings. How does that fit together? And I think that fits together in the end if you say, well, we're all there to help patients, and we want as many patients as are eligible and want it to have the opportunity to take the next step in their treatment options going forward.
Thank you. I mean, you paint a really interesting picture there about risk and perception of risk and management of risk in terms of there are two levels. There's the level of the individual therapeutic and how you supply data so that people understand that risk and enter into a transaction based upon the data that it shows. But also there's another level of risk-taking that the system as a whole needs to take, which is belief in the industry and what is coming. And it's the perception of some that actually the industry is a threat as opposed to an opportunity. And I think that one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves as a group of people is, how do we transform that from a threat, perception of a threat, to a perception of opportunity? Emmanuel.
I like the word transform you just used. It's really about a transformation. Lutz has spoken eloquently about the payers, our relationship with the payers. But if you look at the level of society, in oncology, we still have so many unmet needs in Europe, in the world. And if you have technologies, modalities like cell therapy that can bring huge transformative benefits to patients in Europe, isn't there a responsibility for governments, for healthcare systems to partner with us? We have been investing a lot in the research, development, manufacturing. The pace of innovation is high. Innovation will continue. The pace of change in healthcare systems is obviously lower, but I guess the message to governments, policymakers, payers we work with on a day-to-day basis, it's a shared responsibility to adapt the healthcare systems so that what comes from the innovation ecosystem, the cell and gene therapies, can reach the patients in Europe. Because eventually, if Europe is not adapting its systems, you could have access inequity, where patients in the United States could have access to some therapies that are not made available to patients in key European markets. And that's something we don't like.
Okay, a quick check, see if there's any questions. I have a question over there. Do we have a microphone? Oh, sorry, I was pointing in a different direction. But we'll take this one first and then we'll move over there.
Thank you. My name is Annette Brindle. I write for BioWorlds on media, and I have a question that may be very naive, but you see, Zolgensma is a pediatric drug, and of course, the CAR-Ts are often for pediatric cancers, but cancer in general is a disease of aging. Do you think differently about these coming therapies that are perhaps for the elderly, and that, you know, if somebody gets diagnosed with prostate cancer at age 75, even if you cure them with a cell therapy, they are unlikely to have another, you know, 40, 50, 60 years of benefit. So I'm curious whether you think about these differently and whether you have noticed that the payers think about these differently.
Does anyone want to touch on that? I will. Yeah. So this is a question that I come across quite a lot, and I met with, and I think, if I'm honest, I'm an economist, okay? I'm various other things as well, but what part of me is an economist, so I speak with that lens. It's a pragmatic thing at the moment, and I think we're going to come on to a subject at the moment. The reason that there is a huge emphasis, if you like, on pediatric care is two things. One is because we all get emotionally charged by it, but the other is an economic thing, is in that you need to demonstrate a high level of economic efficacy as well as clinical efficacy in order to achieve the payments that are needed at this moment in the development of the industry. And I think we're going to come on to in a second, I hope so anyway, a conversation about how we think about the cost structure of the industry, how we think about the costs of manufacturing, the costs of use of therapeutics in the clinical setting, and bring down the overall cost of therapeutics. And that is the key to opening up all of these therapeutics to a much broader patient group, not just in terms of elderly patients, but also, you know, I'm starting to see conversations which are coming much earlier than I anticipated about how advanced therapies are going to be used outside of the developed nations. How are we going to produce our advanced therapies that are genuinely serving the world? And that all comes back to a question of the cost base, the efficiency of the industry. But hold that for a second while we come back onto it. I don't think it's an active choice. I think it's a forced choice that's taking place. The microphone, could we move it around? Sorry. Oh, somebody's apologies. I will get the microphone over to you. Sorry. Please.
Thank you. I'm Andrea Sobel from Bergen World Courier. And I really want to come back to the manufacturing and the cost. You have described, on the one hand, you have the extreme of the hospital exemption. On the other hand, you have your central cell and gene therapy factories, yeah, to fully GMP compliant with your fully approved product. Is it a possibility in the middle to have more decentralized point-of-care manufacturing? Of course, under full control of your product, but with the potential to increase the capacities, to increase also the access for the patients, and to bring down the cost. Similar to other products where you had at the beginning very high cost, but when you go to a more broader platform, that you have then the chance to bring down the costs. What is your thinking about decentralized point-of-care manufacturing?
We have heard about decentralized manufacturing a lot over the past few years. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you where we're going to be in 10, 15 years' time. What I can tell you is that if you look at CAR-T, the manufacturing and the supply chain is quite complex. From the initial extraction of cells from the patient in a clinic, the apheresis, to dispatching those cells to a specialized lab or manufacturing unit, then coming back to have an infusion of these engineered cells back into the patients, where the critical factor is time, right? Turnaround time. And these, what you call central manufacturing plants, have been designed and invested, built with the current regulatory framework in mind. And in Europe, it's one centralized authorization framework set up 17 years ago, the ATMP regulation. And so we have planned with that in mind. But to answer your question, yes, I guess any manufacturer would want to improve its manufacturing operations to reduce cost of goods over the longer term. So I don't know if it's going to be somewhere midway, but certainly we have been investing huge amounts of money, all of us, in the CAR-T space to organize consistency, reliability, reproducible process with high quality to ensure patient safety, meeting all inspections from authorities around the world, and that's our world in pharmaceuticals, right?
You have a GMP for ATMP
No,
already.
sorry, excuse me. Can we keep control of the question? I'm going to give a brief answer as well, and I think it's really important to frame your question correctly, because the question should be, how do we bring down the cost of goods, right? And it's not just about bringing down the cost of goods. You have to actually create a competitive environment where the price comes down as well. But it should never be framed in the context of potentially reducing quality. So if you're saying the route to bringing down cost of goods is to reduce in some way the regulatory burden, I think that's a dangerous ground for us to go into. So I think, but the question of how do we bring down the cost of goods for the industry as a whole and localized manufacturing may be part of that. I don't know if there is a manufacturing discussion coming on. It's a very involved discussion, but it is at the heart of the growth of the industry, without a doubt. Bringing down the cost of goods in an environment where we've got multiple therapeutics coming through, and we're trying to talk to the industry we're trying to talk to the healthcare system as a whole and say, we are going to leave something on the table for the healthcare system so that it's a win-win for the industry and the healthcare system, involves all these questions about bringing down the cost of goods. I'm going to move on to the poor gentleman over there who's been extremely patient. And
Thank you. Chris, you said earlier that each country wants their own set of data, and this is not sustainable, that you won't have global data. In haemophilia, many countries have long established national registries which collect core data, but the work is very well advanced on a global gene therapy registry for haemophilia. So my question for you and for the panel is, do you think it's a good idea, and would you support having global gene therapy registries for each therapeutic area?
Yes, I think that's an ideal situation, right? Because then I think we have a global look, and I think that's very, very powerful. I think the problem is everybody wants to, test and learn at the same time, and they require some gates within their own country, even in real-world evidence, for instance, and I don't think that that's sustainable. So I think your point is exactly what I meant by that, is that we have to look at things much broader and take the totality of the data that's available, and not just for that individual country.
Lutz?
Yeah, I think within hemophilia, we know that there's actually quite good databases essentially that's available. And obviously the WFH database is one that I think is being looked at in order to capture a lot of the data that we want to capture for the gene therapy components, as I'm sure you're very, very well aware. And in that regard as well, there's still, however, national requirements that also want data in some type of databases. So we have to try to figure out how can we be efficient in making sure we don't ask physicians to enter data into multiple locations, but how can we kind of cross-reference between databases potentially? And also, how does the data that's captured, is that going to be sufficient for whatever is going to be agreed upon in terms of any risk management or outcome-based agreements that one might want to undertake?
Yeah, that's, I think, the other watch out is that the value agreements and the bespoke nature of some of the access agreements merit that. So your national database may not account for that. And so being very thoughtful at the beginning, you don't know what you don't know, right? And so solving for that up front, I think, is really important.
I think that that question underlies another component of the cost of the therapeutics. Anything that brings in some degree of standardization, whether it's standardization in access to data or standardization in manufacturing processes, starts to bring down the overall cost of the industry. And these things that should be on our dialogue. But to really make it work, actually, we need to have the healthcare system. You can't deal with the registries and the data, the patient data, without the healthcare system having in its head that it wants to facilitate the growth of the industry, that it wants to make things happen and bring it about. And I think that's part of what we as a group have to bring on in the coming years, hopefully just months, in order to really allow the next stage of growth of the industry. Any more questions at this point? Okay, I'm conscious of the fact that we're running short on time. Christine, very quickly, I know we've touched on some of the things that you would have been speaking about. Do you want to just talk to us about some of the other things that you think need to happen in order to facilitate the growth of the industry going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered a lot of them, right? I think this has been evolving. If you would have asked me that 18 months ago, I would have answered manufacturing, right? Capacity, some of the things we just talked about. Would that be knowable and sustainable? I think now we're in a different place. We're already in 2.0 manufacturing where we have scale and we have throughput that's meaningful, that serves the globe, and you know, that's our responsibility, no doubt. I think it squarely comes back to access. I mean, you've heard the conversation lead back to that quite a bit, and it's a red thread for a reason. And while there's lots of opportunities and lots of things I think that we need to solve, what I'll say, just to kind of, you know, put a fine point on, I think the good things that have happened is that we have seen a lot of change and we have had a lot of success, albeit we need more. You know, places like Poland and Ukraine, even during the war, being able to have access arrangements facilitated during those times. Egypt, Brazil most recently. I mean, these are things that, again, in 30 years in this business, I don't think we went into thinking that they would happen this early in our time. Yesterday I was in a meeting and got a text saying that we had our first 2 commercial patients happen in Saudi Arabia, and that's incredible. So I think, you know, inch by inch, we're making progress on the access front and figuring it out as we go. And I think hopefully from the panel and from many of you that I talk to on a regular basis, we're learning from each other and kind of, you know, problem solving as we go, so.
Okay, so I'm going to now ask each of the panelists to give a minute or so of closing comments. There's a couple of words we haven't had in the dialogue which I've tried to introduce, but I'm going to introduce them again just as thoughts. Volume, okay? We talk a lot about price. We don't talk enough about volume, okay? So the profitability of the industry is related to how much you get, but how much product you sell as well. And I think that needs to be part of the dialogue that we talk about. How do we get the industry really flowing? And the other one that comes with that, I think, as a partner in this discussion, is competition. We haven't really had a chance to move on to competition. If all of these therapeutics start to come through, they're going to be competing with each other. So the discussion is going to be less about HTA and more about competitive delivery of the therapeutics to the patients, which could be a win-win for everybody. I introduced those in case you want to talk to them at all during the last minute or so, but if I could ask for some summary thoughts from each of you about where you think the industry is going over the course of the next few years. And I'm going to work this way across again. Lutz.
Yeah, look, I'll start first of all by thanking my co-panelists for I think some good discussion and thoughts that we had. I believe industry is going into a manner where, as I said in the beginning, I think we'll be in a different spot in 5 years from where we are now, and I think you'll be seeing more therapy options available. I hope you will be seeing broader access to those therapy options, which covers the volume component as well. And I'm quite excited, I think, with the patient in the middle to be able to be part of it. I know that CSL Behring is quite excited, and obviously I'm personally quite excited to be able to help potentially shape that progress, and primarily again with the patient in mind. And if we do that, I believe we'll be able to find a common ground with all stakeholders in order to achieve what we want to achieve.
Thank you. Emmanuel.
So maybe you didn't hear it earlier, but I'm an optimistic by nature. Right now we are post-COVID pandemic. There's quite a lot of cost containment in Europe, but we'll be able to manage over time. So 2 things. For Europe, the review of the general pharma legislation could be a plus over time if our regulatory framework is future-proof, and that's going to be a benefit for cell and gene therapies where the EMA might use experts with an experts-based approach to assess our therapies in future. And second, with the European HTA regulation, HTA agencies will learn, maybe the hard way during the first few years, about the specific nature of cell and gene therapies, but over time, I'm confident that thanks to this joint effort in Europe, authorities will ensure proper value recognition and reward for innovation for these great technologies that we bring to patients.
Brilliant, thank you. Christine.
Sounds great. You know, I would say not so much a prediction, but maybe more of a hope. You know, I think we've all experienced the pace of innovation and how it's accelerated in the last decade, and my hope would be that that continues and is exponential, that our learning curve allows us to bring, you know, more incredible products, life-changing products to market. I think with that, forums like this one and panels like this, I mean, think problem solving and chunking things down to make it consumable. No one of these things is solvable, you know, in an afternoon, and I think the more we can share those insights, you know, my hope is as well that we kind of tackle those barriers as an industry and as a collective with the wisdom in this room and all of our colleagues across the globe. Just as a thing that I'm excited about, you know, last week I was at a conference and talking about many of these same things, and we had some patient families join us, and there was a little boy that was one of our first patients on Zolgensma, and we were talking about outcomes and value-based agreements and all of these things, and as I left the conference, I went to go say goodbye to his family, and he grabbed the bottom of my coat, 7 years old, and he said, "Mrs. Fox, I am the outcome." And I was like, you know, if that doesn't symbolize like all of the things that we do, yes, we're talking about the constellation of things, but at the end of the day, it really brought it home for me.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Right, closing comment from me. You know, we've heard about an industry that's clearly established, but it's established proof of concept. We've talked about the changes that are coming through and the growth and the opportunity there. There has been no doubt in any of this conversation that this industry is here and is going to grow. And the question is, how do we, as a group, work together to facilitate that growth and to bring the healthcare systems and the national systems with us so that the patients benefit ultimately. And with that, I'd like to thank the panel for their contributions. Thank you very much.